Every crime tells a story, and every story deserves to be heard. For more true crime stories, kindly hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. In 1977, the world watched as a convicted murderer made a shocking request. He begged to be executed. This is the chilling story of Gary Gilmore, the man who turned America's justice system into a spectacle and left behind questions that haunt us to this day. In the winter of 1940, Portland, Oregon wasn't the glittering city of progress it tried to project in magazines. Behind the neon lights of downtown were streets scarred by poverty, taverns packed with broken men, and neighborhoods where families lived paycheck to paycheck. It was here that Gary Mark Gilmore was born, January 4th, 1940, into a family already fraying at the edges. His father, Frank Gilmore Sr., was a man of contradictions. A small-time hustler with a mean streak, Frank drifted through jobs and scams, carrying the smell of cheap whiskey and the temper of a man who always felt cheated by life. His mother, Bessie, was softer but powerless, trapped in a cycle of raising children while shielding them from Frank's fists. The Gilmore household was not a home. It was a battlefield. Gary grew up in a place where laughter turned to screaming in seconds, where glass bottles shattered against walls, and where silence was often safer than words. For Gary, childhood meant fear, and the belief that violence was as normal as breathing. By the time Gary was 10, he had already learned to fight back. Teachers at school described him as bright but restless, the kind of boy who could solve a math problem but couldn't sit still long enough to finish it. But the fights at home left marks that no teacher could grade. When Frank beat Bessie in front of the children, Gary would sometimes stand in front of her, fists clenched, daring his father to hit him instead. More often, though, he ran out of the house, hiding behind garages or in alleys until the shouting died down. He started stealing cigarettes from corner stores, then candy, then pocket knives. At first, it was for survival, a way to have something that belonged only to him. But soon, it became a thrill, a way to feel control when his home life spun out of it. By 13, police knew his name. A juvenile officer once told his mother, "Mrs. Gilmore, your boy is headed for real trouble. He's not afraid of anything, not even punishment." He was right. Gary wasn't afraid. Not of the law, not of pain, not even of death. Somewhere deep inside, the idea had already taken root. Rules were just walls to be broken. At age 15, Gary was arrested for the first time for car theft. The moment the handcuffs clicked, he smirked. To him, jail was almost a badge of honor, proof he could do what others only dared to dream. Juvenile detention was supposed to scare boys straight. But for Gary, it was an education. He learned how to bluff, how to fight dirtier, how to read people's weaknesses. One counselor described him as a volcano in waiting. Quiet one moment, explosive the next. But there was something else. Gary was intelligent. He read books others ignored, memorized details about cars and tools, and developed a sharp tongue that could charm or cut, depending on his mood. When he was released, he promised his mother he would change. But the streets called louder than home ever could. Within weeks, he was stealing again. By 18, he was already a repeat offender. Gary's late teens and early 20s blurred into a cycle. Theft, arrest, probation, release, theft again. He wasn't stealing out of hunger. He stole because it made him feel alive, like the world owed him something and he was collecting the debt. But with every arrest, the punishment grew harsher. Juvenile detention turned into real prison time. And prison did something to Gary. It stripped away whatever thin layer of restraint he had left. In prison yards, violence wasn't just survival, it was currency. Gary fought often, usually winning. Guards labeled him dangerous, and fellow inmates kept their distance. He carved a reputation. Not the biggest man, but fearless, quick to snap, quicker to strike. What haunted him most, though, wasn't the fights. It was the silence of nights, when memories of his broken family filled the darkness. He wrote letters to his mother, often begging her to believe he could change. But when parole came, the old cycle swallowed him again. The spiral was tightening, and everyone around him saw it. In his late 20s, after yet another release, Gary tried something new. He attempted to live a normal life. For a brief moment, it almost worked. He found work as a mechanic, fixing cars with skill and speed. He even dated a young woman seriously, dreaming about marriage and a future outside the walls of prison. But Gary's temper never stayed buried. Arguments turned violent. Nights at bars ended in fistfights. Coworkers quit speaking to him. And soon, the urge to steal, that old hunger, clawed its way back. One parole officer later said, Gary Gilmore wanted to be normal, but normal bored him. He needed chaos like other men need air. It was true. Gary didn't know how to live without the rush of risk. Normal life felt like a prison, and crime felt like freedom. By the mid-1970s, Gary Gilmore's rap sheet was long, and his chances were few. After serving a sentence in Oregon, he was released in 1976 into the custody of his cousin Brenda in Utah. Utah was supposed to be a fresh start, a quieter place with fewer temptations, where he could rebuild his life. Brenda wanted to believe in him, wanted to give him the family support he'd never had. For a while, Gary tried. He worked odd jobs, painted signs, and spent afternoons sketching. He even fell in love with a young woman named Nicole Barrett, a single mother with her own troubled past. Their relationship was intense, magnetic, and destructive all at once. But Utah wasn't a cure. The same old demons followed him. Rage, theft, violence simmering just beneath the surface. And soon, the man Utah hoped to rehabilitate would become the man who dragged the entire state into a storm it hadn't faced in decades. Murder, trial, and the first execution America had seen in 10 years. Perfect. Now that we've laid the foundation with Part 1, Chapters 1 to 6, we'll push into Part 2, Chapters 7 to 12. This is where the murders and the manhunt unfold, turning Gary Gilmore from a troubled ex-con into a national headline. I'll write it in the same book-style true crime tone, cinematic, emotionally deep, and relatable to a U.S. audience. Utah was supposed to be Gary Gilmore's chance at redemption, but instead it became the stage for his downfall. By summer 1976, Gary had moved in and out of odd jobs, his temper sabotaging most of them. But in the middle of this restless spiral, he met Nicole Barrett, a 19-year-old single mother of two. She was fragile, searching for stability, yet drawn to Gary's intensity. Their relationship was a firestorm. They broke up and reconciled almost weekly. When they were together, they locked themselves away, feeding off each other's pain and passion. When they were apart, Gary would spiral into drinking, theft, and angry outbursts. Friends said Nicole was terrified of him and yet couldn't let go. One recalled, he was like a drug to her, dangerous, unpredictable, but she couldn't stop coming back. Nicole wanted safety. Gary wanted salvation. But together they were gasoline and fire, a love story already burning toward tragedy. On the night of July 19, 1976, Gary Gilmore walked into the service station in Orem, Utah, carrying a .22 caliber pistol. Behind the counter stood Max Jensen, a 24-year-old Mormon, husband, and father of two small children. Jensen was working the late shift to make ends meet, tired but polite as always. Gary ordered him to hand over the cash. Jensen complied immediately, no resistance, no fight. But Gilmore's eyes were hard, and in that moment, compliance wasn't enough. He forced Jensen to lie on the floor. Then, without hesitation, he raised the gun and fired twice into the young man's head. Jensen never stood a chance. The killing was swift, cold, and unnecessary. Gilmore left with little money but carried something darker. The rush of bloodshed, the sense that he had finally crossed a line he could never return from. Less than 24 hours later, Gary struck again. On July 20th, 1976, he entered the Motel Inn in Provo, Utah. Behind the desk was Benny Bushnell, a war veteran and family man. Like Jensen, Bushnell didn't resist. He handed over the money, calm and cooperative. But again, Gary demanded more. Obedience wasn't enough. He ordered Bushnell to lie face down, and then, just as he had the night before, he shot him dead. Two innocent men, two senseless murders, two families shattered in the span of a day. Police immediately noticed the similarities. Compliant victims, execution-style shootings, no clear motive beyond the thrill. Utah, a state not accustomed to such violence, was suddenly gripped by fear. The question whispered in homes across the valley was simple. Who could do this? The killings sent shockwaves through Utah. Provo and Orem were quiet towns, communities built on faith, family, and trust. Murders like these, cold-blooded, execution-style, random, were unheard of. Police worked quickly. Witnesses remembered a man leaving the scenes, driving a Ford truck. Descriptions circulated. Roadblocks went up. But Gary wasn't careful. He bragged to acquaintances, flashed the gun, and showed off Jensen's college class ring, which he had stolen as a trophy. The arrogance was his undoing. On July 21st, 1976, just a day after the second murder, Gary was spotted driving the truck. Police attempted to stop him. He fled, leading them on a brief chase before crashing into a curb. When he was pulled from the wreck, bleeding but alive, the gun was still on him. He was caught. Utah breathed a sigh of relief. The killer was behind bars. But for the victims' families, relief was hollow. 2 lives were gone, and no arrest could bring them back. Gary was booked into jail, and almost immediately, the silence of confinement pressed in on him. He had lived in cells before, but this time was different. This time, there was no chance of release, no probation to hope for. He sat for hours, days, staring at the ceiling, scribbling in notebooks, drawing, replaying the murders in his head. Sometimes he seemed proud, other times haunted. When investigators questioned him, Gary gave little. He refused to explain why he killed men who had done everything he asked. No robbery motive made sense. He had taken less than $150 total. The truth was simpler, darker. Killing for Gary wasn't about money. It was about power. It was about the thrill of life and death balanced in his hands. But Utah prosecutors weren't interested in psychology. They wanted justice. And justice, in 1976, meant the possibility of something America hadn't seen in a decade: the death penalty. As Gary sat in his cell, 2 Utah families were burying their dead. The Jensen family struggled with the sudden absence of Max, a man remembered as gentle, devoted to his faith and his children. His wife was left a widow in her 20s, holding their 2 little ones as neighbors brought casseroles and condolences. The Bushnells grieved just as deeply. Benny's widow described him as the kind of man who would give the shirt off his back. His children couldn't understand why their father wasn't coming home. For both families, the trial ahead would not heal wounds. It would only reopen them. They wanted justice, yes, but more than anything, they wanted answers to the question that would never truly be answered. Why did Gary Gilmore have to kill? By late summer 1976, the state of Utah buzzed with anticipation and dread. Newspapers splashed Gary Gilmore's face across their front pages. Radio hosts debated whether Utah should pursue the death penalty in his case. The community wanted justice for Max Jensen and Benny Bushnell. But beneath the demand for punishment was something else, a collective unease. Utah hadn't seen murders this brutal in years, and America itself hadn't executed anyone since 1967. Would this case be the one to reopen that door? For the victims' families, the answer was clear. Max's widow told a reporter, "I don't want him to suffer. I just don't want him to be alive when Max isn't." Benny Bushnell's brother echoed her. He took Benny's life for no reason. He shouldn't get to keep his. The prosecution built its case carefully. They had witnesses who placed Gary at the scenes, physical evidence tying him to the murders, and the stolen property from Max Jensen. They didn't just want a conviction. They wanted certainty, the kind that could withstand appeals. But Gary complicated matters. He didn't act like other defendants. He admitted to the killings. He told anyone who would listen that he was guilty. And more than that, he demanded the death penalty. His defense attorneys were stunned. Most clients fought to save their lives. Gary seemed determined to throw his away. One of his court-appointed lawyers confided to a colleague, "I've never had a client fight this hard to die." The trial opened in October 1976, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for space. Families of the victims sat in the gallery. and Gary Gilmore entered in handcuffs, eyes sharp, his posture almost defiant. The prosecution laid out its case with brutal clarity. They showed how both victims complied with every demand, only to be shot execution style. They argued that Gilmore killed not out of necessity but out of cruelty. The defense, meanwhile, struggled. How do you defend a man who insists on confessing? Their only hope was to spare him from execution, but Gary undercut them at every turn. He leaned forward at one point and said aloud, "Why prolong it? Just do it." Gasps rippled through the room. When Nicole Barrett was called to testify, the air in the courtroom shifted. She was young, fragile, barely able to look at Gary. Their love affair had been a whirlwind, and now she was being asked to relive it under oath. She spoke of his temper, his violent moods, his desperate love. She admitted that they had spoken of dying together, of suicide pacts, of escape. The jury listened, rapt. Some pitied her. Others judged her for staying with him. But what lingered most was her quiet whisper. "He said if he couldn't have me, nobody could." It wasn't a confession of murder, but it revealed the obsession that consumed Gary and how it spilled over into the rest of his life. After just a 2-day trial, the jury reached its decision. Gary Gilmore was guilty of murder in the first degree. Now came the question of sentencing. The state pushed for death. The defense argued for life without parole. But once again, Gary defied expectation. He stood before the judge and said, "It's just me for the firing squad." It was stunning. No one in the courtroom, not the jury, not the lawyers, not the families, had ever heard such a thing. A man not begging for mercy, but demanding his own execution. On October 7th, 1976, the court sentenced him to death by firing squad, Utah's method of execution. The verdict sent tremors far beyond Utah. For nearly a decade, America had paused executions while courts debated the constitutionality of the death penalty. Now, with Gary Gilmore, the debate roared back to life. Some Americans saw his case as justice long overdue. Others saw it as a dangerous step backward. Editorials filled newspapers coast to coast. Churches debated morality from the pulpit. Lawmakers braced for renewed battles over capital punishment. And through it all, Gary sat in his cell, calm, almost content. He had been condemned, and for once in his chaotic life, he seemed certain about what he wanted. But the question remained, would the system grant him his wish or fight to save him from himself? In the weeks before his scheduled execution, Gary's days took on an eerie normalcy. Breakfast came at dawn, usually cold eggs and toast. Guards escorted him to a small exercise yard where he walked in slow circles, staring at the mountains that loomed in the distance. Winter snow capped their peaks, a stark reminder of a world that was moving on without him. Some guards treated him with contempt. Others spoke to him like any other man. They knew they were part of a historical moment, but Gary seemed uninterested in history. "I'm just trying to get to January 17th, he muttered to one guard. "And then I won't have to worry about this crap anymore." By early January, the prison was surrounded by journalists. Television crews set up camp. Reporters chased interviews with anyone who knew Gary, and the case dominated nightly news. The media framed it as a moral crossroads. Would America return to executions after a 10-year pause, or would something intervene? Local residents felt the weight too. Some wanted Gary shot immediately, insisting it was justice for the victims. Others held candlelight vigils outside the prison walls, begging for mercy. Salt Lake City, a place usually far from the national spotlight, became the center of America's most divisive debate. As the execution date drew closer, appeals flared up again. Religious leaders begged the governor for clemency. Civil rights groups filed emergency motions. Even some jurors expressed second thoughts. But Gary was adamant. He told anyone who would listen that he did not want mercy. "This is my decision, no one else's. If they want to save me, it's for them, not me." The courts, exhausted by the back and forth, finally cleared the way. The countdown resumed. Nicole Barrett made one last trip to the prison. The glass separated them as always, but the distance felt unbearable. She pressed her hand against the barrier. He mirrored her. "You'll find someone better." Gary told her softly, though he didn't believe it. "Don't waste your life on me," she cried openly, ignoring the guards watching them. He spoke of love, of regret, of a future that would never come. When the visit ended, Nicole stumbled outside, nearly collapsing in the parking lot. She knew she would never see him alive again. On January 16, 1977, Gary ate his last dinner. A hamburger, hard-boiled eggs, baked potatoes, and black coffee. He refused dessert. That night, he wrote a handful of letters. Some were to family, some to Nicole, and one to his attorneys. He left no apologies to the families of the men he killed. His remorse, if it existed, was buried too deep to be found. Near midnight, he slept. Guards reported he was calm, almost peaceful. Outside the prison, the air was sharp with winter cold. Reporters huddled by fires, waiting for dawn. The next morning, January 17, 1977, Gary Gilmore was led to a cinder-block room inside the Utah State Prison. The firing squad was already in place, separated by a curtain. He wore a simple shirt, trousers, and a black hood that was placed over his head. Witnesses, journalists, lawyers, and state officials filled the small gallery. The silence was suffocating. When asked for any last words, Gary's reply was chilling in its simplicity. "Let's do it." Moments later, the rifles cracked. The sound echoed across the prison walls. Gary Gilmore slumped in his chair, and America's first execution in nearly a decade was complete. When the gunfire ceased, a heavy silence settled over the chamber. Smoke from the rifles hung in the air, faint but sharp. Witnesses shifted uncomfortably, some scribbling notes, others simply staring at the lifeless figure in the chair. One reporter whispered to another, "History just started again." Outside, word spread quickly. The world had been waiting for this moment, the first American execution since 1967. Within minutes, radio stations broke into programming. By noon, headlines were already racing across the country. Gary Gilmore executed by firing squad in Utah. For the families of Max Jensen and Ben Bushnell, the news was bittersweet. Justice, in their eyes, had been served, but nothing about the execution brought their loved ones back. Max's widow, a young mother of two, told a reporter outside her home, "They did what they had to do. But tonight, I still have to explain to my children why their daddy isn't here." Ben Bushnell's family expressed quiet relief, though privately some admitted that they felt uneasy celebrating another man's death, even Gary's. The punishment had been final, but healing still felt out of reach. Gary's family reacted differently. His mother, Bessie Gilmore, wept for days, both for the victims and for the son she could never save from himself. His cousin Brenda, who had fought publicly to prevent his death, felt crushed. "I wasn't fighting for Gary because I thought he was innocent," she explained later. "I was fighting because I didn't want the state to kill anyone, even him." But Gary's last words haunted them. "Let's do it." He had chosen his fate, and the family was left with the wreckage of his choices. Across the nation, reactions were polarized. Supporters of capital punishment celebrated, saying justice had returned to America after a decade of indecision. They argued the execution proved the system could still enforce consequences. Opponents decried it as barbaric, a step backward for a nation striving toward modern justice. Candlelight vigils were held in major cities. Some quoted scripture. Others carried signs reading, "Killing is not justice." Television talk shows, newspapers, and even pulpits lit up with debate. Utah's firing squad had reignited one of the deepest moral divides in American life. The story didn't end with Gary's death. His execution inspired books, songs, and later a television movie. Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song turned the case into literature, blurring the line between journalism and art. Punk rock bands wrote about him. His last words became slogans, repeated with both irony and reverence. Gary Gilmore, in death, had become a symbol, not of redemption, but of defiance. Decades later, the shadow of Gary Gilmore still lingers. His execution marked the beginning of America's modern era of capital punishment, opening the door to hundreds of executions that would follow. For the victims' families, the grief never truly ended. For his own family, the shame and sorrow lived on. For the nation, the questions remained. Was it justice? Was it necessary? Or had the state simply become the mirror of the violence it condemned? Gary Gilmore's life and death left no easy answers. Only the undeniable truth that 2 innocent men were gone, and one man's rage had rewritten history. In the end, Gary Gilmore's story was never just about Gary Gilmore. It was about Max Jensen and Benny Bushnell, the lives he cut short. It was about families who grieved in silence while the world obsessed over their killer. It was about a young woman, Nicole, who became collateral damage in a national spectacle. And it was about us, the audience, the society, the country, that chose to look at Gilmore and see a symbol when what we should have seen was a warning. Violence destroys more than bodies. It destroys families, futures, and sometimes even the people who loved the ones who caused it. As the decades rolled on, the echoes of that winter morning in 1977 continued to ripple. But in the end, silence spoke louder than gunfire. Nicole's silence, the victims' silenced voices, and the unspoken truth that justice is never simple, never clean, and never free of pain. For more true story contents, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell to get notified when a new content is dropped, drop your comments in the comment section, and also like and share this video. See you soon.